Welcome everyone to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm an associate professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm very honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor André Blais of the University of Montreal. André is one of the world's leading experts on voting behavior, and his many accomplishments include publishing dozens of books and scientific articles, including in all of the top journals in political science. He is also well known as a leading supervisor and mentor in the field. I experienced the broad reach of André's influence personally when recruiting researchers to this ERC project. Of the 70 people who applied for positions, André and his research team were among the most mentioned influences, with one applicant noting, quote, "My colleague told me to go be a visitor at Montreal because everyone who goes to visit there, good things happen to them," and he was right. To make the most of our time with André, a few notes on how we'll run this webinar. First, André will speak until about the top of the hour. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who've prepared questions in advance. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for André's response. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions in the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts for panelists' review. Thank you all for joining us. And André, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure, I guess, to present one of my pet projects, I guess, over time. It's a very peculiar one in many ways. I'm sure we'll have some discussions about it. I think I will present it rather shortly. We'll see. Perhaps sometimes I will have new ideas to present as we go along. So the title is, as most of the time with me, I guess, ends with a question mark. And it's about the kind of electoral system or electoral outcome that people think is good for democracy. So let's go into the project itself and some of our main findings. Well, it's not going, I have to click, I guess. Okay. So the question that really, I guess I wanted to address with many co-authors, many co-authors in this paper, because I wanted to have the feedback from many different people that have a very broad project, is a very traditional one, which is the best voting system, how people vote and the transformation of votes into seats and how governments should work. And so this is the basic question, but basically in this paper, in this study, we tackle it indirectly in the sense that we look at different electoral outcomes. And electoral outcomes, of course, are partly the result of voting systems. So it's an indirect route to I guess, to ask ourselves, is there a system that is perceived by citizens as the most democratic? So it's really part of the debate about electoral systems, about is it better to have few parties or many parties? Is it better to have a proportional system in which the percentage of the seats that the party has most or less equal percentage of vote it gets, or is it not important? Should there be a coalition government? Is it good to have a coalition government or not? Is it better to have majority or minority government? Why? Under what circumstances? And in the debate of electoral systems, these questions pop up all the time and people focus on different aspects of this debate. But they also often come up with concrete examples of electoral outcomes that are deemed to be democratic or undemocratic. You will not be surprised to learn that sometimes people who sort of prefer the simple majority, the British system, for instance, would refer to Israel as a case that we should avoid. Too many parties, sort of big coalitions, perhaps too much voice for extremist parties, and all kinds of arguments that used by those who prefer a simple majority system. But on the other end, also there would be references to British election outcomes in which a party can get into power with less than 40% of the vote. So there are all kinds of concrete examples also used as to basically support one's preference for one system over the other. So looking at a concrete example of electoral outcomes is, I thought, a good way to look at people's view about democracy and about which voting system is best or worst. The approach that we use in this study is, in a way, rather simple. It's really getting people to evaluate different electoral outcomes. I suppose that when we sort of look at outcomes in a given country, we perceive it to be good or bad, or neither good nor bad for democracy. So that's a very sort of simple way of looking at it. And the outcomes that are presented to respondents are basically the distribution of votes, distribution of seats in the legislature, and which parties are in government or not. So that's a typical sort of outcome of an election. So it's basically having people to evaluate different kinds of outcomes and which ones are deemed to be better or worse for democracy. What is particular about this, and I'll come back to in the conclusion about this aspect, is that we do not indicate the country in which this outcome occurs, nor the parties. That's the only two pieces of information that we don't present. Otherwise, we present real concrete result, but we don't specify in which country they occur and which parties, get how many votes. Because we are interested here, I guess, in principal views about democracy, what kind of results there should be, irrespective of partisan preferences and irrespective of potential biases for or against different countries. So it's really sort of looking at principal views of democracy. And the basic approach has been to present people with vignettes of these outcomes and to ask them to evaluate these outcomes and how good or bad they think they are for democracy. Each respondent gets 5 of these 15 vignettes, and this is, of course, produced randomly. So if you understand the study, if you want to just think about whether you would participate in such a study, you would present 5 different vignettes of actual results that have occurred in different countries. So that's the kind of outcome that we presented people, basically. We didn't tell them that this was coming from Austria. We didn't tell them which parties they were, party A to party G. But people were basically, with sort of vignette, they were basically told that basically there were 3 large parties with over 20% of the votes and 4 small parties with less than 10% of the votes. That in terms of seat share was more or less the same. So it was basically proportional with a bit more seats to the larger parties. And that in government, there were a coalition of 2 parties, and that these 2 parties were formed by 2 large parties, the party with the most seats, and then the third one, and that they were a majority government. So they got a lot of information in this small vignette. And basically, we wanted them to indicate whether they thought this was very good, very bad, or neither good nor bad for democracy. So they were presented 5 of these scenarios. The study was completed in 15 West European countries, 1,000 respondents per country. As I mentioned, each respondent gets to evaluate 5 vignettes out of 15, and this was randomly produced. And they were presented a typical read outcome in each of the 15 countries. In each of these 15 countries, we selected the previous 5 elections, and we selected what is the most typical in terms of the effective number of parties in parliament. So basically the median, which is sort of in a way the most typical in terms of vote share of parties in parliament. And the respondents were invited to reach each outcome on the scale of 0, very bad, to 10, very good for democracy. So a very simple thing, it's with real electoral outcomes, but people were not told that this outcome was occurred in one specific country, and they were not told which parties they were involved. So it's just in terms of the distribution of votes, of seats, and who's in government or not. Hypothesis. I should specify that these hypotheses were not formulated clearly at the outset. It's not a privileged study. This was very much hypothetical. I was personally very, very interested, curious about trying to determine which country would be perceived to be the most democratic in terms of outcome. So it was just a very sort of curiosity. I convinced a lot of other co-authors to join me in this project. I think I had many of these hypotheses were basically there in my mind, but had not made them explicit. And this, so it's not a deductive approach. It's partly, at least, mostly at least inductive. So the hypothesis first is the number of parties in parliament, the higher the rating. So that overall, people would prefer an outcome in which there were many parties are represented in parliament. That they value diversity. They think it's better if different viewpoints are represented, so that everything else being equal, the more parties in parliament, the higher the rating of an electoral outcome. So that's first hypothesis. Hypothesis two, the higher the disproportionality between vote and seat share, the lower the rating. So basically, the assumption here is that people prefer outcomes in which proportion of seats correspond more or less to correspond to the percentage of votes. That they prefer proportionality, that because it's perceived to be fairer. So that's the second hypothesis. Everything is equal. People prefer more proportional outcomes. The third one, the larger number of parties in government, the lower the rating of an electoral outcome, which comes in contradiction, if you like, which hypothesis one. Here, people prefer fewer parties in government. The assumption is that when too many parties, it's much more difficult to make decisions. It's also can become a lot more unstable. So that's people would prefer a lot of parties in parliament, but fewer parties in government. I've skipped hypothesis 4, which is a bit complicated and which was not confirmed. I can, of course, come back if you prefer in the Q&A section. Hypothesis 5. Which is about minority governments, basically that people do not like minority government, or at least they perceive minority government as being less democratic. Basically, I assume because they are perceived to or thought to be less stable, but that wasn't that clear in my mind, because there was also some argument in the literature that minority government could also be deemed to be more democratic. But the question of whether it's minority governments are perceived to be less democratic than majority governments is interesting. Hypothesis 6 basically is the larger the vote share of the governing parties, the higher the rating, the electoral outcome, so that coalitions are deemed to be more democratic when they are more supported by the electorate. So this seems to be intuitively, makes a lot of sense that people think that if the governing parties have a lot of support, they are more likely to be deemed to be democratic. And finally, hypothesis 7, which is that people give higher ratings to electoral outcomes that are similar to the electoral outcomes in their country. This is basically that people are more at ease with familiar outcomes that they're used to, that there is, in a way, a status quo bias, that people basically want a system that basically they are the kind of outcome that they are used to. So these are the different hypotheses that we tested. Again, they were not formulated ex ante, though I think that most of them had probably in mind at the beginning of the study. The findings. These are the 15 countries, and the country that sort of wins in terms of the highest rating overall is Germany. And the second one is the Netherlands. At the bottom, the country whose outcome is deemed to be the less democratic is Spain. And just next to it is Denmark. You can note in passing that the first two countries are countries which are proportional systems, but also in which there are a coalition between two parties, only two parties. And that in Denmark and Spain, they are minority governments. So that also already indicates that these factors might be at play. At the same time, I think it's very important to note that the differences are not huge. Germany has the highest rating with, I think it's 5.7, and Spain at the bottom, I think, is 4.6. So no country gets, no outcome gets a mean above 6 and none above below 4. So the differences are relatively small. And this is when I was reading the paper again before the presentation, this didn't come up as clearly as I think it should have been in the paper. The differences are not stark. There is no consensus, in a way that this is the outcome that's really perceived to be democratic by almost everyone, or undemocratic by almost everyone. So the differences that we're looking at are relatively small. That being said, we sometimes look at the results, and we sort of find that most, but not all of the hypotheses are confirmed. I will just focus on column 1 and 2. 3 is related to hypothesis 4, which is a bit more complicated. Perhaps the most interesting result of all, as in most of my research, is a nil result, and that's the Gallagher index, which is a disproportionality index, is not significant. So there is no support for the assertion that people prefer proportional results as such. At the same time, however, there is some small support for the idea that people prefer more parties. The effective number of parties has a positive but very small coefficient. So that result, and that result is not very robust in general. So there is a slight support for that hypothesis. There is a clearer hypothesis for the 3 other factors, that the outcomes in which there are more parties in government are deemed to be less democratic, bad for democracy. When the governing parties have a lot of votes, more votes, they are perceived to be more democratic. And finally, majority governments are perceived to be more democratic than minority governments. So these are the 3 results that are relatively clear and also relatively robust, because we perform all kinds of robustness checks, and these seem to be quite robust, that people basically want a system in which there are not too many parties in government. These parties are popular, they have support, and there is a majority government. So that's the main result of our study. We also look at, this is the last hypothesis, look at whether these results vary across countries. And the basic result here is that they do not, which is a big surprise, I guess, to me. As I had expected quite different results across countries. We did that in many different ways. Here we sort of do exactly the same regression across different countries, and we see that for the 3 main variables, number of parties in government, majority government, and vote share parties in government, the results are quite consistent across for each of the countries. And we also look previously in one table to show the correlations between the evaluations across countries, and they're all positive, so that the scenarios that are evaluated more positively in Britain are also more positively evaluated in the Netherlands, for instance. So that's a sort of remarkable result, because there is a sort of many findings that which show that people are used to the system, and they basically want many times to keep the system that they have in place. In our study, this is not the case. There might be many reasons for that difference. One of them, I guess, that we don't present the parties at all. Eh? So we're blind about parties. So that might be a reason why we have these strong similarities across the different countries. Conclusion, I think I'll get there for this evening quickly. First conclusion that we did not draw, and I think we should have, is that the differences among all these scenarios are relatively small. That there is no clear consensus about exactly what a good electoral outcome is in democracy. That being said, there are some differences, interesting differences, and the major pattern is that it seems that outcomes in which there is a majority government with strong electoral support but not too many parties are deemed to be the most democratic. This means that there is no clear adhesion to PR or to the majoritarian vision, in the sense that the Gallagher index variable is not significant, so that results that are could be perceived to be unfair are not deemed to be necessarily not bad for democracy. It's really what really matters is that having a majority government, strong electoral support, but not too many parties. At the same time, such an outcome is much less likely to occur under single majority system. For the simple reason that usually in those systems, you rarely have parties that have more than 40% of the votes, and that party will usually govern alone, most of the time majority, sometimes minority. So even though there is no clear support for the PR vision, indirectly at the same time, I think it should be mentioned that the countries where there is another system, that I'm thinking about Britain and France in particular, are not deemed to be among the most democratic. That's pretty clear. Finally, very little differences across countries. And that's a result that I found quite surprising, I guess, in a way, that respondents from the Netherlands didn't react differently from respondents from France or Britain. So that's quite interesting and intriguing. I will end with a number of limitations. I'm sure that there are others. I'll sort of point to those who are most clear to me at this point in time. The first one is a question about which I don't have a clear answer now. And I sort of always think about it and exactly what should be done about it if we want to make sure that people pay attention to all pieces of information that we provide. We provide information about votes, about seats, and about who is in government. Is that too much? Are people looking at this vignette always already focused on one part or not? Might vary across individuals. How to make sure that people really pay attention to all pieces of information is a big question about which I don't have a clear answer now. Further studies, I haven't dealt satisfactorily with this question. I would be very curious to see what kind of ideas you have about this. The second limitation is about the use of the word democracy. Democracy have all kinds of connotations. The fact that in our question we use good for democracy, bad for democracy, raises all kinds of questions about what they really thought about, what people really thought about it. Democracy is a loaded word, it's a sort of vague word in many ways, so perhaps this is not the best way to approach, though we were interested in principal views about what is, so that it sort of makes sense, but still have doubts about whether this term should be used at all. The third question, what about parties? That's the biggest question of all in my mind. We wanted them just to think about distribution of votes and seats, but we know that people have partisan views, that there are some parties that they strongly like and strongly dislike. And should we include them in a survey? And what are the pros and cons of not including? The fourth point is the number of scenarios. We have only 15 scenarios. And all the differences that we look at, basically it's about these 15 scenarios. And this is, I think, clearly a limitation of our approach. So based on these recognition of these limitations, in fact, we've just, with Carolina Tlesia and Damien Boll, we've just conducted a follow-up study in Germany, about which I could talk a bit more if we have time at the end, in which we proceed in the same way to present different kind of outcomes, only in Germany, just only in one country, with a huge sample, 5,000 respondents. with a lot of scenarios, potential scenarios about distribution of votes, not a vote, of seats among the 7 major parties, then how many seats in cabinet, and which party is the chancellor from. So a lot of scenarios, many more scenarios. We identified the parties. Suppose this is the result with this party, AFD is first, and whatever, okay? And we also, the dependent variable is about acceptability. We basically ask them how acceptable or unacceptable they would personally find such an outcome, which is closer to the notion of consent, which is a very important, I guess, criterion in the literature, something that I think is really in the crux in a democracy, whether people accept the result or not. So we sort of basically try to address some of the limitations of this first study especially identifying parties, asking about acceptability and presenting a lot more scenarios to have more variation across the different outcomes that people are exposed to. Again, with 5 different scenarios in each case. So this is still, I think, a huge question about, what's good in a democracy, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I'm sure that there are very different ways of addressing this question. This is a first step in that direction, and I look forward for your comments, questions of all sorts. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre, for such a clear presentation of this important contribution with a number of co-authors. I see at least one of your honored co-authors here, Professor Karolina Plesia. If she wants to contribute in the Q&A, you're welcome. I'll now introduce our 3 panelists who will ask their questions one after the next. And we'll hear Andre's responses to these questions all at once. So Andre, if you want to take notes, go for it. And a reminder to participants, you're welcome to send to any of the co-hosts in the chat any questions that you'd like to be considered for the second round of Q&A if you haven't done that already. So our first question is from Amir Gara, who's a first-year BA student at BGU. Amir.
Thank you, Professor Andre. One question we discussed as a class as relevant for next steps research is how the findings may differ in a more diverse set of countries, especially including countries like Israel that have many small parties and a very diverse population. If you were given the opportunity of an unlimited budget to conduct a next step study that would extend the study to additional contexts, how would you design the research? Thank you.
Thanks, Amir. Next, we have a question from Charlotte Cobb, who is a researcher at Reichman University.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. This article focuses on the country as the unit of analysis, but from my experience in the United Kingdom, I was wondering if you and your co-authors have thought about researching how respondents' answers may differ in multinational governing bodies like the UK or the European Union.
Thanks, Charlotte. And our final panelist question is from Yaniv Shapira, a PhD student at Haifa University.
Thank you, Andre. I thought the result of your study very insightful, particularly the finding that citizens place more weight on government composition and prefer a small number of parties in the government. However, this result appear more descriptive because they describe reality but do not explain why these preferences exist. Do you have an explanation regarding why you think citizens prioritize the composition of government over the parliament? Or why do you think that the voters prefer fewer parties in the government? In another word, what do you think that are the mechanisms that drive these findings? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks to our panelists for these questions, and we'll now hear Andre's responses.
Thank you so much. These are great questions. I'm not sure I have all the answers to these questions, but let's let's give it a try. Having a diverse set of countries, no time budget, no budget constraint. This is awesome. A first problem, I guess I should mention, is that it's very difficult to compare parliamentary system and presidential system. You mentioned Israel, but because we're thinking about Asia as well. And in new democracies, many of the new democracies have presidential systems, and I've been thinking about it. This kind of analysis can be conducted only for parliamentary system, and there is a different question about presidential system, which is a huge one. If I were allowed to have a more diverse set of countries, I think I would probably use the same approach. The only problem, I guess, is that assuming again that this study would be conducted in all these countries, and I would select sort of a typical outcome in each of these countries, I think it could be conducted in the same way, basically. The only problem, I think, is that it's the question of how much information we provide, and whether it's possible for people to focus on all aspects of that are presented, votes, seats, and which party is in government or not. It's very difficult for people, I think, to think about systems in which are very, very different from theirs. So the only, I guess, concern I would have is to make sure that people understand exactly what's at stake. So my initial, I guess, view would be to do exactly the same, but to do a pretest in quite a few countries to see how people, once people have responded to the question, have a sort of a discussion with them to sort out exactly what's in their mind and whether we're missing something important. So that would be my main, I guess, reaction, that this approach could be used for a more diverse set of countries. But I say that with some hesitation, I would really want to do a pretest to confirm my intuition. Second question about multinational. Well, I'm from Canada, right? So it makes a lot of sense to think about multinational case. Exactly how this would occur, my initial reaction, I don't know at all. What's really interesting, would be interesting for me, would be that in a country in which a different voting system is utilized in different parts of the country, or is utilized, for instance, at the federal level, and a different one is utilized at the regional level. Or I'm also now interested in municipal elections. So the challenge here would be to find a country where the system is different. It is somewhat different. I think Australia would be perhaps the best case. I think there are some differences in sort of the electoral laws in different kind of results. There's a difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives. So my sort of initial reaction would be to focus on Australia. And it would be I would have to basically make sure that I understand exactly all the electoral functions at different levels. And it would be fascinating to see differences between the national, the regional, and I would even argue the local level. So it's a great question. I would like to think, I would have to think much more about it. But that's, for a Canadian, that should be the normal place to go. Why the mechanism? You're absolutely right. Basically, when formulating the hypothesis, we sort of mentioned very briefly why we think that some results might be deemed to be more democratic than not. The only way to do this, and it required a bigger study, would be to measure people's attitudes and values, and then to see whether they explain some of these results. For governing parties, for instance, having few governing parties, I guess the importance that people attach to efficiency would be the normal way to go. And about the place of the relative importance of government versus parliament, I'm not sure that this is related to values or principles. My hunch is that this is just a recognition that the decisions that made at the executive level, that governments matter more than parliament. So I'm not convinced that this is related to values, but for the importance or I guess the aversion to the number of parties in government, then this could be related to relative importance that one attached to efficiency versus representation, for instance. And that would be the next step in the analysis would be to measure people's attitudes and see how they are related to their reactions. Thank you so much for these questions. They are really, really important.
Okay, thanks, Andre. We'll now share with you a select number of questions that the panelists have identified from those that were submitted to us in the chat for a second round of question and answer. And we'll start here with a question from Yaniv. Yaniv?
Yes, thank you. So this is a question from Professor Orit Kedar. Given your main result on party support and number of parties, is it fair to say that voters think of democracy as a high level of representation with a minimal level of accountability? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And we'll proceed to our next question from Charlotte.
Thank you. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about the follow-up study and why you chose to focus on Germany?
Okay, and I believe we may have had another question come in. Amir, do you have a question you want to ask?
Yes. You said that the composition of parliaments and governments are related casually and conceptually. This might be less obvious to ordinary citizens. My question is, why might this be less obvious to ordinary citizens? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks to our webinar participants for submitting these questions and to our panelists for selecting them. So we'll now hear Andre's responses to these questions.
These are tough questions. The first question, I'm not sure I quite understood. I mean, the question of representation versus accountability. Basically, I guess I think our results suggest that people are concerned with both. That they want representation so that more parties in government, especially that in the parties that are have strong support. But they are concerned also about accountability because they assume that if there are too many parties, this will be very difficult for government to function, and also perhaps to determine which party is accountable or not for a given policy failure, for instance. So my reading of the evidence is that they are citizens are concerned about both. And it's not absolutely clear that they put more emphasis on one or the other. At least this is what I think the results would suggest, personally. Germany.
I'll note, since we have the honor of having Professor Orit Kedar asking the question in here, would you like to add any clarification to that question or any follow-up?
Oh, just very briefly. Thank you, Andre. I guess what I meant was, given the results, can we assume that that's how your voters define democracy? That that's how they think about democracy? If they're asked about democracy and their results or their answers reflect those two or answers that we as political scientists know that they reflect those two values, would you go to the next step and say, well, that's how my respondents probably define democracy?
I hadn't thought about this as such, but my initial answer is yes. That this is the assumption, I guess, underlying the whole, approach. That because we use the word democracy, so that basically this is what they ask about the outcome debate. Bad for democracy, that this reflects their views about about what should be done. And if we look more at the individual level, if we have data about the relative importance attached to each of these two criteria, hopefully they should be related, but it's an assumption that I cannot test here.
Thanks, Orit, for chiming in. And Andre, you wanted to proceed to the next question?
Germany. It's interesting, and Karina will know that we have quite a few discussions about which countries to use or not. I think the reason, I guess, we chose Germany, well, first, it's a big country. Publishing about a big country is easier than about a small country. But I think more importantly, they've always had coalitions. So all the scenarios that we could come up with would make sense in being coalitions. On top of that, they've been all majority coalitions. They've never had minority governments. So the question of majority versus minority, which I guess we dealt with in this paper, we could ignore and focus on the most important questions, which is basically what kind of coalitions, majority coalitions, are deemed to be most acceptable or not. And on top of that, I think we thought that there was, because of the vote intentions in Germany right now, there are all kinds of plausible scenarios that sort of make sense, would vary a lot in terms of vote seats and also kind of coalitions. So basically what we did in Germany, we took the vote intentions at the time of the study, which was this just a few months ago, and basically assumed that the parties, for instance, let's say CDU is basically at 30%. Basically, the seat share of CDU varies in all these scenarios between 20 and 40, plus or minus 10 points. And we do that for all the parties. So it produces a lot of different results that also in terms of votes, we don't present votes, in terms of seats, and also in terms of coalitions. We have a lot of potential coalitions that can be formed afterwards. So that's the reason why we took Germany. They use coalitions. It's always just majority coalitions, and we can produce a lot of potential outcomes that are at least somewhat plausible and for which we can get the citizens' reaction. So that's the reason I think we opted for Germany, but Professor Carolina can perhaps add some caveats. I can't read my handwriting. I wanted to question here. Are the relationships between votes and seats? We sort of, I guess, political scientists know that there is a sort of a strong relationship between votes and seats, especially here under proportional representation. We just assume that many citizens haven't thought this through, and that because they haven't thought this through, this might not be sort of obvious to them that there will be a strong relationships. So we really want them to think about the votes and the seats and to make the links. That raises a big question about how much time people spend on each of these vignettes, how much attention they pay to each item or not, and that's still a big question mark. And this is why I would personally sort of like to do the same kind of exercise, but in small groups of citizens who can discuss among themselves to see what kind of results we would have. So that in a survey, the main problem, I guess, one of the main limitations is people don't want to respond quickly, and whether they really pay attention to all pieces of information that we provide. And that's still a big question mark for me.
Okay, I'll highlight a few more questions that we discussed as a class. And if any of the other participants want to ask more questions, you're still welcome to send them in. And I see I just received a direct message question/comment that I'll read out from Professor Carolina Plesia. She noted that her internet connection is not good enough for video or sound and asked if I could read it out. So I'm going to read out what Carolina wrote. She said, "We did not talk a lot about ideology. And I was wondering, this is what she wrote, I was wondering what Professor Blais thinks about the role of ideology in evaluation of these scenarios. Is ideology a moderator in the evaluation of some of the factors in these scenarios, or is an important factor per se for acceptability of election outcomes?"
Well, in this study, we did have a robustness check in which we check whether people who are the left or the right assess these scenarios differently, and the results were basically nil. So there is no evidence that people from the left evaluate the scenarios differently from people of the right. But this was just a robustness check. We could have conducted more in-depth analysis of that result. But you would assume that in general, for instance, I guess an observation is that leftist parties in general are slightly more inclined to be favorable to PR than so at the elite level. I think there is a correlation. It's not clear that there is one at the citizens, at the mass public level. But that's clearly an interesting question. Partisanship is a different thing. And partisanship, I think, there clearly plays a big role, and that's what we observe in Germany. That people react quite differently depending on whether the CDU or the AfD is part of the coalition, for instance.
Thank you. I've received a few more direct messages. Let me check with the panelists. Do any of our course panelists have a question that you personally want to ask or that you've received?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So, Andre, you mentioned that there are little differences between countries, but do you think that the result may differ between different type of voters? For example, more educated and less educated voters, or left voters versus right voters? Thank you.
Yes, we conducted some analysis of this, and we found very, very, very little differences. But I should mention that this was not the main purpose of the project, so perhaps we could have dealt into it much more deeply. But the initial results suggest very little differences in terms of we test education, we test left-right ideology, and we also, I guess, look at compare supporters of big parties versus small parties, and initially very little differences, which is interesting and somewhat surprising.
Thanks,
but
Andre.
There might be more complex relationships that, for instance, perhaps education plays a role only in certain types of countries and so on. So we didn't go in that direction. So there will be a lot more to examine. But initially, the first results suggest that there are little differences. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. I'll proceed now to a question that came in from one of our course participants. This is from Judy Chafetz, who is a Bar-Ilan PhD student. She wrote, how do you explain the preference for majority governments at Switzerland, Belgium, or the UK, that their population is so diverse? And Judy, I'll welcome you. Do you want to add anything to, there was a second part of the question that didn't fully come through. Is there anything that you'd want to add to that?
You listen, it's okay. You listen, okay. What I thought it's more about, Switzerland and Belgium, more than maybe the United Kingdom. Belgium, we know that all the time they have problems and they fight each other, and it's a very thin, I don't know how to explain it. It's a nation state that hold with maybe, I don't know, something very, it seems that it will be dissolved very quickly. They all the time have problems between the North and the South, the French part and the Dutch part, you know, the Flemish one. And I asked myself how, you know, they want majoritarian. If there are 60% of Flemish and 40% of French, and they want majoritarian way of, you know, government. So the French never will have some, and you know, no, they will not be represented freely. You know, it's 60% always that it's, you know, they have the power. So I don't understand how they choose the majoritarian.
Excellent. Thanks for that question.
And it's not the only one country. Spain. I don't want to, you know, even to talk about it because you know they have the Catalonian, they have the Basque, they have, I don't know.
From the look on Andre's face, it sounds like he doesn't really want to talk about Spain either, but let's hear his question, his answer to the whole question. Yeah.
Funny now.
Yeah,
the first
Andre.
one, which is just to be stressed, is that we did not include Switzerland, and that's I can't remember any comment from anyone about the non-inclusion of Switzerland in our data set. So we didn't do a survey in Switzerland, and we didn't have a Swiss result because it's not clear exactly. Switzerland works somewhat differently. That there is this tradition of a four-party coalition, and that there is the result of the formation government is not clearly dependent on the results of the election itself. So we decided to exclude Switzerland. I just want to mention that, even though I have a lot of interest for Switzerland from other things, but we thought it would be better to exclude Switzerland. For Belgium, you know, we do not mention which part of the country they are come from. This is what in Belgium there were many parties as such. But you know, in Belgium, they have also a tradition of making sure that there are representation at the government level, that there are parties coming from both regions, both from the Flemish and the French regions. Because I want to sort of stress the fact that what we're interested is the idea that the government should have a majority of the seats. So it's quite different. You know, it doesn't mean that there's a majority of the population that is represented in government. It really struck me in Germany, for instance, in the last election. From a Canadian perspective, the normal outcome should have been a minority government. It would be much easier. But Germans seems to be very preoccupied by the pitfalls, potential pitfalls of minority government, because they are, of course, very concerned about stability. But there is this perception that it is much better to have a majority government in many countries. And most citizens seems to accept that view. So that, you know, in our data set, the cases, but it was Spain, it was Denmark, it was Portugal, and there was I don't know what in Sweden. I think we have 4 cases of minority government, and these were deemed to be, you know, less democratic than the others. Everything else being equal.
Okay, thanks, Andre. I have one more question that got sent to me. Did any of the other panelists have a question you'd like to add in before I note this one? Okay, we got a question from Ram Hardy, who's a PhD student at Tel Aviv University. And his question, we discussed this also in our class, his question relates to the survey methodology that you and your co-authors used in the study. The subjects were presented with real election examples in a blind test and asked to score each option so that it enhances external validity. But Ram notes he's curious about the theoretical options that were not included because they aren't used in any current electoral system. And he brought an interesting point. These options might hypothetically yield better scores. So drawing an analogy from another field, before the iPhone was introduced, a survey could have shown smartphones with keyboards as a preferred choice, but we recognize the superiority of touchscreen smartphones. So this question of how do you account for the potential of such untested theoretical options in your study? And if we can ask, we're closing in on the wrap up of our time, so I'll suggest to answer it as best you can, and Ram can do follow-up conversation with us at a later point.
It's a limitation. Basically, you know, I was very curious to see how people react to actual results, outcomes that we've observed, I guess. There could be much more extreme results in many different ways. We've now we're testing them, some of them in Germany, a lot more variation. So I accept that as a limitation. But it's not clear exactly what kind of other results we could have observed. I thought we basically look it as very interesting to see what kind of results which are actual results are deemed to be most democratic and least democratic. So I accept it as a real limitation of the study.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to André and to our panelists for leading this webinar, and to participants for asking such great questions. We really look forward to seeing you again in upcoming seminars. Our next seminars, we have the next one in a month with Professor Rachel Gibson from the University of Manchester. She is the principal investigator of an ERC Advanced Grant, and she's going to be presenting on online political influencers. And the month after that, we are honored to have Professor Hari Han, who will be focusing on organizing and democracy. So thanks again to all, and we look forward to seeing you in upcoming webinars.